The diplomatic pressure has been building on Berlin to send its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, or at least allow countries that bought them from Germany to re-export them. We're joined now by Thomas Sparrow, German correspondent. Thomas, good morning.
Good morning, Pat. Nice to talk to you.
I'm trying to figure out exactly where we stand with the German government, whether the foreign minister has given the nod to Poland to allow those tanks to be moved to Ukraine, and whether Olaf Scholz has said, no, you can't.
Well, basically, the latest that we've heard, and this was just something that happened a few minutes ago, was a meeting here in Berlin between the new German defense minister, Mr. Pistorius, with NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. And in that press conference, Mr. Pistorius said that Germany still had not come to a decision, that partners who already had Leopard 2 tanks ready to be deployed could start training Ukrainian military personnel, but that as far as Germany's decision came on whether to allow the deployment of those tanks, especially those that Germany has in its own stock, Germany still needed to continue with its analysis and with its internal discussions before coming to a decision on that matter.
Now, the polls, it looked like we're going to do it anyway, irrespective of what Berlin might have said.
There are legal questions as to whether Poland could actually do it, and if they do, what would then be Berlin's reaction. But contractually, what is important to understand is that any German-made tanks that have been exported to countries like Poland would have to have an agreement from Berlin if Poland is to resend them to a different country, in this case, Ukraine. The same applies to Leopard 2 tanks that may be in possession of other countries like Finland or the Baltic states or other countries within Europe. So basically, there's one thing is the contract. The other thing is what countries like Poland have been saying. I interpret Poland's comments as putting more pressure on Berlin to ultimately authorize the deployment of those tanks.
The difficulty for Poland, if they do move those tanks into Ukraine without permission from Berlin, there would obviously be the problem of spares, ammunition and so on, which are specific to the Leopard 2, which might not be supplied to those tanks.
Absolutely, that is one of the issues here at stake, and that's probably why Mr. Pistorius also stressed today that one of the issues that Germany is now discussing and weighing internally, but also with its international allies, it's not only how many tanks are available, what state those tanks in, but also the issue of spare parts and maintenance. That is one of the issues why Germany has not come to a complete decision on the one hand on whether to allow third countries like Poland to send their own Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, and on the other hand, whether Germany would do the same with the tanks it itself owns. So we have to distinguish between those two elements. It seems that Germany has signaled it's moving towards authorizing countries like Poland to send their own tanks. On the other hand, when it comes to Germany's own tanks in its own Bundeswehr stock, I think that's a different matter. And that's why within the German government, there are differing views on what should be the next course when it comes to the deployment of those tanks.
Yeah. The argument, I suppose, is that Germany is playing it softly, because the war will end someday, and Putin may or may not be the president of Russia after that cessation of hostilities, who knows, but that Germany is going to have to get on with Russia one way or the other, in the midterm, rather than necessarily the short term, and that's part of Berlin's calculation.
Not necessarily if you view it from the way Berlin is dealing with it. There are obviously understandable criticisms coming from Germany's allies that maybe Germany is a reluctant leader, that it has been reticent when it comes to sending those tanks, that it makes decisions too slowly. But when you look at it from Berlin's perspective, on the one hand, Germany has stressed on various occasions that it is one of the most important suppliers of weapons also for Ukraine, not only weapons, also politically, economically, in terms of humanitarian aid, something that, by the way, Mr. Stoltenberg stressed today during his press conference. But on the other hand, that Germany has signaled an important shift when it comes to its political and military priorities. Germany was, for a very long time, very reluctant to send any kinds of weapons to conflict zones, and that obviously changed with the beginning of the war in Ukraine. But that is a change that, from Berlin's perspective, cannot happen overnight, and that's why you see all these internal debates, not only now with the Leopard 2 tanks, but right from the beginning of the war in Ukraine, even with smaller things like like other kinds of weapons or helmets or all sorts of other issues. This is a debate that we've already seen before. And from Germany's perspective, it's all about making decisions with the partners and avoiding any unilateral stance. And in particular, this has to do with the United States. Germany would want the United States to also deploy tanks so that it's not only German-made tanks, or at least heavy tanks, that go to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah. And finally, Thomas, the question of public opinion in Germany, how is it divided?
It is very divided, in fact. We've seen several polls in the last few weeks in which more people at the beginning seemed to be against the idea of delivering those tanks and allowing other countries to do so. More recent polls have seen more people, but not yet a full majority, saying that they would probably accept the delivery of those Leopard 2 tanks. But it is obviously an issue that divides German public opinion, that has divided German public opinion for a long time, not only when we're talking about Leopard 2 tanks, but in general about the delivery of any kind of weapons to conflict zones. Again, that is something deeply embedded in German political culture, if you will. The fact that Germany, after the Second World War and as it developed in the last few decades, was not going to take part in military conflict. And that's why this shift that I'm talking about, the fact that Germany is indeed sending military weapons to Ukraine, is something that has to happen step by step with a lot of political debate and also trying to understand what public sentiment is also behind.
German correspondent Thomas Sparrow, thank you very much for joining us on the programme.